Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me on this second lecture in Conservation in Action. This is still the intro series, it's just the second lecture, and we're talking about understanding ecosystems and biodiversity in this lecture. So, through an overview of what we talked about in class, first we talked about ecosystems, interconnectedness, and resilience. Then we talked about biodiversity, beyond species richness, and throughout both of these topics, we talked through debates surrounding conservation, questions that might not have a specific right or wrong answer, just something to kind of think through and process with fellow classmates. So, yeah, it was a great time talking about those. And then lastly, we have the third point, which is threats to wildlife, an intro for the next lecture. Moving on to the central question, we are discussing how does understanding ecosystems and biodiversity contribute to actionable change, and why is it essential for a conservation initiative's effectiveness? So throughout this whole presentation, I kind of wanted everyone to think about this central question and understand why it's important to bring it all back to the importance. Like, why are we even thinking about this? Especially when it comes to a room full of people who are interested in biology and animals and conservation. Why is this important? And why is it essential to understand the basics, even when we're so motivated to understand the specifics of whatever you're studying at the time? So, an introduction, just a recap from the first lecture of class. We did a syllabus review, then we did a fun fact bingo. I'm so happy with how it turned out. Thank you guys so much for participating in that if you came to class that day. And we also watched a video that kind of talked about in situ versus ex situ conservation within habitats versus outside of habitats. And we talked about the five key principles of conservation, which, to summarize them, are policy, management, education, research, and partnerships. All of these principles of conservation are super important. And we're kind of gearing towards a new lens when we're talking about those five key principles of conservation when we're diving into this lecture. Instead of just naming these key principles, now we're going to talk about how each of the careers surrounding these key principles of conservation can each contribute different ways to conservation, and how important it is that every single one of them know the ecosystem surrounding their focus, because to create change, there are many factors at play. So, first, we're going to talk about interconnectedness a little bit. And what I wanted to mention with this term is emergent properties. This is kind of an interesting vocabulary term, in my opinion, because intuitively it might seem a little strange at first. When we're talking about emergent properties, we're talking about ecosystems are more than the sum of its parts. And when I thought about that at first, I'm like, what do you mean more than the sum of its parts? But when I say that, I think of a forest, and it's more than just trees, right? What makes up a forest? It's the trees, it's the soil, it's the air, the water, all the creatures that live within it, and these components interact in different ways, such as resilience, niche expansion, and spatial reorganization. Uh, and throughout all of these different interactions, this creates a system that's more than the sum of its parts. A great example of this is nutrient cycling. Plants absorb the nutrients from the soil, animals consume plants, and when the organisms die, they decompose, returning the nutrients back to the soil. But this synergistic interaction is more than just plants, soil, animals. It's these interactions between everything. Disrupting one part of this cycle, for example, using excessive fertilizer, can have cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. And what I wanted to bring it back to when I talk about this is that what this means for conservationists is that their efforts should not only focus on protecting trees, for example, but maintaining the balance of these ecosystems through their interactions, ensuring the health of each of the parts of the systems interactions is crucial for the forest's overall resilience and sustainability. Speaking of resilience, I wanted to move on to a slide about resilience because I feel like we can use this term a lot and really not understand exactly what it means. So, to review, resilient ecosystems can resist, recover, and adapt to disturbances while still providing essential services. When I think about resilience, I think about forest fires, for example, like the ones we just had in Southern California in the LA area. A resilient ecosystem is one that can withstand this kind of disturbance and bounce back. It can recover its biodiversity over time. One key thing to talk about when we're talking about resilience is keystone species, because they play a vital role in maintaining this resilience. And these species have a disproportionately large impact on their ecosystem. So when those species are kind of taken away, for example, sea otters in a kelp forest, when sea otters are kind of taken away, the sea urchin population, their prey, are kind of able to grow exponentially and absolutely decimate the kelp forest. This happened in California, actually, before the recovering of the sea otter population. So when we talk about a keystone species, that is so crucial to maintaining resilience of an ecosystem, and super important when we're talking about a conservation perspective as well. They're definitely a priority. Number two, ecosystem services. These are some benefits that humans derive from ecosystems, such as clean air, water, pollination for crops, and flood control. And if we think about the economic value of all of these services, it's immense, like almost unable to quantify all of these services to humans. But what this means for conservation ultimately is a guide for prioritization and marketing investment as well. So, this is super important when thinking about ecological recovery from a stakeholder's perspective. Like, who are you marketing this plan to? Who are you talking this through with? And if you're talking to someone who might not hold that same inherent value of nature that you do, it might be useful to use these ecosystem services as a way to quantify their benefits to humankind to someone who may not hold the exact same moral standard that you do, in terms of inherent value for an ecosystem. So another example with marketing, in terms of marketing a conservation action or initiative or policy, picking out a keystone species in an ecosystem is a good priority for immediate attention and is way more marketable than something maybe less descript or less cute and cuddly and fuzzy, we have to think about this kind of thing when we're talking about how we're going to market something that is going to change policy. Ecosystem services help advertise investment in ecological recovery programs to people who might not have that intrinsic value of nature, like I said before. So, both of these are really important when we're discussing resilience. And then we had a little discussion about some important questions within conservation, kind of multifaceted questions. There's not really a right or wrong answer to these, just kind of bouncing off ideas off of each other and what we really thought about these questions. So if you have the time watching this video, you can pause it and read through these questions, kind of prioritize in your head like what you would do in that scenario. And it was a really interesting discussion during class. Moving on to biodiversity beyond species richness. And species richness is one way that we count biodiversity and is a great data point to have. But I think also something that might get overlooked sometimes is the importance of functional versus genetic diversity. And when we talk about functional diversity, we're kind of talking about the variety of roles that a species plays within an ecosystem. And for example, I use the example of pollinators within a meadow, and each type of pollinator, like bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, every single one of them has a unique role and contributes to the overall pollination success. So, this functional diversity of niches increases the resilience of this pollination network. And so, it's really important when talking about conservation to focus on functional diversity just as much or more than genetic diversity. So through this slide, I just wanted to mention that genetic diversity is what allows populations to adapt to changing environmental conditions such as disease outbreaks or climate change. When you think about it, if a disease emerges and a population with a high genetic diversity would be more likely to have individuals with resistance to that disease. But if human activities like habitat loss and overexploitation happen, that can dramatically reduce genetic diversity, which is what leads to this next little vocabulary term, genetic bottleneck event. To summarize, this can severely weaken a population's ability to adapt and survive. And after talking about those terms in class, we kind of discussed a few more questions kind of related to these points and introducing a few more concepts and kind of shared with the rest of the class what our opinions were on this and how we feel like we should prioritize functional over genetic diversity or the other way around. I think it was a great discussion to have because some of these concepts might not come to mind when talking more ideally about conservation, because there are a lot of challenges that come with conservation, especially in a space where in the US it's not really prioritized as a very uh, as a very urgent need or emergent emergency, basically. So it's a really important thing to talk about prioritizing funding, prioritizing how we're going to market a certain new policy or act or management strategy. It's super, super huge. And then we watched a summary video, which I'm not going to show here in these slides just because it won't be able to play. But on B courses, we also have the video linked. And you can also look it up on YouTube. It's called Why is Biodiversity Important? And it's actually David Attenborough using his narration skills to uh, kind of narrate through why biodiversity is important. And one thing that was brought up in class that I really wanted to mention was this video is also very interesting because it talks about very tangible ways that biodiversity is important without taking into context the inherent value of nature. Because a lot of these videos that are talking about why is biodiversity important? Why should people care? It's a lot of like, oh, it's pretty, it's beautiful, it's lovely, all these animals deserve to live and everything. But for someone who might not hold an inherent love or value, like we've been saying throughout this whole lecture, to those things, it's really important to think about why is it important for them? Maybe they don't really care about the views or the cuddly animals, but maybe they care about health. Maybe they care about medicine. David Attenborough talks about how sloths are actually a key part in making a certain type of medicine that can reduce, I believe, breast cancer, but double check me on that. Watch the video. It's actually a great video. So I recommend. And it's only 5 minutes, so it doesn't really take long to watch. Moving on to the conclusion, I think when we bring it all back to the central question of this lecture, how does understanding ecosystems and biodiversity contribute to actionable change, and why is it essential for a conservation initiative's effectiveness? I think of understanding these concepts as crucial for effective conservation. We need to adapt to a interdisciplinary approach to conservation and integrate. This is done with integrating knowledge with economic, social, and political considerations, collaboration among scientists, policymakers, and local communities is essential to address complex challenges facing our planet. And I believe that throughout this lesson, we kind of talked about why that is. All those people who work within the 5 key principles of conservation need to be addressing this rising need for understanding the big picture and why is it all important and why it's important to talk to people who don't exactly have the same beliefs as you. And then I was going to go into a preview of the next lecture. So, next lecture is lecture 3, and it's the last lecture of the intro series, and we titled it Threats to Wildlife. So, we're going to dive into some of the most pressing threats of wildlife today and kind of talk about the challenges conservation initiatives face and how they're trying to circumnavigate those. Quick announcement. I don't know if you're watching this video within this time frame, but if you are, we're going to a field trip on to Point Reyes on Saturday, March 8th. We're going to go see the elephant seals at Drake's Beach and possibly see elk and whales as well. They're super common in Point Reyes right now. So, and it's also prime pupping season for elephant seals right now. So it's going to be such a cool trip. It's optional, no credit, but it's a really fun opportunity, and we have funding to pay for transportation, food, and other supplies. So if you're interested in coming to this field trip, please use the Google link in B courses to fill out your name and info, and I'll make sure to keep a spot for you. Second announcement is that I have a interview with Dr. Gladys Kalema Zikusoka, who is a world recognized wildlife vet from Uganda. I actually met her at the WCN Wildlife Expo in San Francisco, and we kind of talked about her book. Since then, I've read it. It's just an incredible memoir of her experiences as a wildlife vet, her challenges that she's faced, the amazing accomplishments that she's done with throughout her career, and it's just an amazing book. So I completely recommend anyone who's looking for a good, inspiring conservation reading from someone who has been in the field for a very long time. Definitely check out her book. And if you have any questions for her, please fill out a different Google form on B courses, and I'll be sure to send those out to her and kind of do a little Q&A video so that we can show that interview and Q&A section during class. So yeah, thank you guys so much. This was the attendance QR code, but the QR code is disactivated now. So if you're watching this after the fact, it won't be active anymore. And make sure to fill out the weekly reflection if you missed this class. And thank you guys so much for listening. And I hope to see you next week for Threats to Wildlife. Thanks. Have a good one, everybody. Bye.